Welcome to the It Is Written podcast. As doubts about God's will arise, the world resorts to feelings and experts. We go to the law and to the testimony of God's word. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about King Hezekiah, the king of Judah. When we know there are things we need to do to please God, are we willing to do them, even when it's hard?
So we look at a lot of bad examples in the Bible of people who did wrong, but there are some inspiring and good examples. No one perfect, but other than Jesus, but some very good examples. And one of them is a king named Hezekiah. In 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 3, it says, "He did right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father David had done." There's only one valid king to compare with Hezekiah, and that was David. There was only a couple of other kings that it says they followed David without reservation. That was Asa and Josiah. And Hezekiah is in that then threesome of kings that were just like David. There's more space given in the book of Kings to Hezekiah's reign than any other king other than Solomon. So that also shows his importance and just the example he is to us. He did a lot of good things. Would you read 18:4?
Yeah. He removed the high places, shattered the sacred pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake that Moses made, for until then the Israelites were burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan.
So he removed the high places. You know, that the kings had a hard time with that. Some of them were pretty good, except they wouldn't remove the high places.
What were the high places?
Places where they worship God or sometimes idols, but they weren't the temple in Jerusalem,
right.
The one place where they were supposed to offer sacrifices. Right. So he broke those down. They had that bronze serpent that Moses had made back in Numbers chapter 21 and made an idol out of it.
Yeah.
And he cut that to pieces. It's amazing what people will do. They have a lot of engineers
and relics
doing wrong.
Yes, and I think people do that today with different relics and worshiping the item rather than the creator.
Exactly. Yeah. So he trusted in the Lord, verse 5, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. We see that he is unparalleled in his trust in God. It says in verse 6, "For he clung to the Lord, he did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses." God was very pleased with Hezekiah. And I think he's a good example for us. I'd like for us to look at Chronicles. Chronicles tells us more about Hezekiah. And just see some of the things he did as kind of a model for us. Hezekiah also receives more attention in Chronicles than any other king except David and Solomon. So it really shows you the importance God put on Hezekiah's reign. Let's look at some things that he did. Read 29:3.
"In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the Lord's temple and repaired them."
Now his predecessor Ahaz was horrible. He closed the doors of the temple and quit worshiping God. First year, first month of his reign, he opened the temple back up. That shows you where his heart was. Chapter 30, verse 13.
Yeah, it says, "A very large assembly of people was gathered in Jerusalem to observe the festival of unleavened bread in the second month."
So in the second month, he's already observing the festival of Passover and the unleavened bread. And then in 31, verse 7.
"In the third month, they began building up the piles, and they finished in the seventh month."
So by the seventh month, he finished piles of goods for the Levites and the priests so that they could resume their work in serving God.
Yeah.
Month by month, you see Hezekiah's commitment from the very beginning to the Lord. And there's just so many good things about him. Look back again at chapter 29 as we see some of the things that he did. He consecrated the Levites to serve and worship God. In verse 11, he says, "My sons, do not be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him, to minister to him, and to be his ministers and burn incense." He's really encouraging the priests and the Levites to fulfill their roles that God had given them. He's an encouragement to everyone to do the right thing. He also purified the temple. Why don't you read verses 16 to 18?
"The priests went to the entrance of the Lord's temple to cleanse it. They took all the unclean things they found in the Lord's sanctuary to the courtyard of the Lord's temple. Then the Levites received them and took them outside to the Kidron Valley. They began the consecration on the first day of the first month. On the 8th day of the month, they came to the portico of the Lord's temple, and they consecrated the Lord's temple for 8 days. And on the 16th day of the first month, they finished."
In verse 18.
"Then they went inside to King Hezekiah and said, 'We have cleansed the whole temple of the Lord. the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, and the table for the rows of the bread of presence and all its utensils.
That's an important aspect of turning back to God, is cleansing, cleaning out the garbage, the sins, the wickedness, the false things, the things that were wrong. And there's a lot of Hezekiah that is opposing the bad practices of his predecessors.
Yes, verse 19 specifically, they said, we've set up and consecrated all the utensils that King Ahaz rejected during his reign when he became unfaithful.
Yes. Yeah. So it's necessary to do some house cleaning stuff when it comes to serving God, and they did. They offered a lot of sacrifices to God. You read about that in chapter 29. And they follow the blueprint of the worship God wanted in verse 25. God stationed the Levites with cymbals, harps, and lyres. They used the musical instruments of David in verses 26 and 27, so they reestablished the musical praise that God wanted in the Old Testament, following the blueprint that David left them. They had a great celebration. It was to the point where the available priests were swamped, so the Levites had to help getting all those sacrifices offered. Just a tremendous outpouring of worship and sacrifice to God. And then in chapter 30, there's a tremendous Passover celebration. And this Passover that Hezekiah celebrated was special in several ways. For one thing, the people weren't consecrated. The priests hadn't consecrated themselves enough in the first month of Hezekiah's reign to perform the Passover, so they postponed it to the second month. Now they did that following the teaching and instruction of Numbers chapter 9. Numbers 9 said if you were unclean or on a trip during the Passover, you could have a makeup Passover 1 month later.
Yeah, we did an episode on that.
They did that on a national scale here because they weren't prepared to offer the Passover in the first month, so they do it in the second month. That's interesting that he had observed that teaching in Numbers chapter 9.
Yes.
Read verses 10 to 12, chapter 30, verses 10 to 12.
The couriers traveled from city to city in the land of Ephraim and Manasseh as far as Zebulun, but the inhabitants laughed at them and mocked them. But some from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. Also, the power of God was at work in Judah to unite them, to carry out the command of the king and his officials by the word of the Lord.
This is interesting. He invites his brethren in the northern kingdom to come down and observe the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's encouraging. He wants all of the Israelites to be able to enjoy that. Many of them mocked him, but some came because of his influence. You see in verse 14, they arose and removed the altars which were in Jerusalem. They also removed all the incense altars and cast them into the brook Kidron. He's doing a lot of demolition work to get them purified and cleansed so they can observe this Passover, which is so good and so right that he do that. Then would you read verses 18 and 19?
A large number of the people, many from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, were ritually unclean, yet they had eaten the Passover contrary to what was written. But Hezekiah had interceded for them, saying, May the good Lord provide atonement on behalf of whoever sets his whole heart on seeking God, the Lord, the God of his ancestors, even though not according to the purification rules of the sanctuary.
So some of the people that observed this Passover were impure by the purification rules of the sanctuary. And what Hezekiah does was exactly what he should do. He prayed for God to forgive those who prepared their heart to seek him, and God healed the people. There's a passage in 2 Chronicles 7. There's almost the key verse in 2 Chronicles, and there's many parts of it that follow this pattern. 2 Chronicles 7:14, and my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. That's exactly what Hezekiah did, and that's exactly what God did. He forgave and healed them, even though they had partaken of the Passover in an unclean way, in an unprepared way. And then, verse 23 of all things. Would you read 30, verse 23?
The whole congregation decided to observe 7 more days, so they observed 7 more days with joy.
The Feast of Unleavened Bread was a 7-day feast. Yeah. They liked it so much they wanted to give another week to the Lord.
Yeah.
You don't see that too often today. You know, you ever heard somebody who said, well, that was a great Bible study. Can we do it for another hour?
Yeah.
We love worshiping God. Can we do it more? You know, we're usually trying to figure out how can we do less of worshiping God and studying his word. But they wanted to do more, so they added another week of celebration. So you see, this was just a very unusual Passover, and it really is a kind of a distinctive mark of Hezekiah, that he led them in this return back to God. He did a lot of other reforms. Chapter 31, verse 1.
When all this was completed, all Israel who had attended went out to the cities of Judah and broke up the sacred pillars, chopped down the Asherah poles, and tore down the high places and altars throughout Judah and Benjamin, as well as in Ephraim and Manasseh, to the last one. Then all the Israelites returned to their cities, each to his own possession.
Are you seeing a pattern here? Coming back to the Lord and restoring God's worship requires a lot of demolition. It requires a lot of cleaning house, throwing out the things that are not pleasing to God so that we can do the things that are pleasing to God. Mm-hmm. We often like to have positive sermons, positive preachers, just affirm us in what we want to do. Mm-hmm. Well, Hezekiah did not affirm the people in the errors that they made. He threw all that out. He demolished and destroyed so that they could worship God in the way that was right. He also was very concerned about providing for the Levites and the priests to do their jobs. And I find it particularly interesting in verse 4. He commanded the people who lived in Jerusalem to give the portion due to the priests and the Levites, that they might devote themselves to the law of the Lord. That's an aspect of the priest and Levites' work that maybe we don't think about a lot. Not only were they leading in the worship and in the temple procedures and so forth, they were also studying the word so they could lead the people and instruct them in doing what God wanted them to do. Mm-hmm. They needed time to be able to do that. Time they didn't have to work. Here is where he's providing for the priests and Levites so they don't have to work, so they can spend their time studying to learn what God's will was, so they could communicate that to the people. That's a big responsibility. There needs to be people today who are studying extra and trying to learn exactly what God says so they can help us to understand what we need to do and how we can please God. Mm-hmm. So Hezekiah is just such an encouraging example. I want to come back to 2 Kings 18 as we close this idea. 2 Kings 18, verse 22. When the Rabshakeh of Assyria had come and invaded, God delivered Hezekiah. But in verse 22, he said, "But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and has said to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem?" To the Assyrians, the fact that Hezekiah tore down the high places and all these places of worship to God that were unauthorized and unfaithful to him meant he was against God. The truth is, that's what endeared him to God. He was finally one of the kings that was willing to tear down the high places and get the people to do exactly what God said in worship instead of the things that they had invented. People in the world look at that as being anti-God, but really that's pleasing God when we turn against the things that are wrong and that God hasn't permitted. So Hezekiah is just a great example for us. I thought it'd be good to look at some positive example of a king that really did the right thing and pleased the Lord, and it's a good example for us today.
Thank you for listening to the It Is Written podcast. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to share with us, feel free to send Gary an email at garyfisher1063@gmail.com. We hope you have a blessed day.